Buon pomeriggio a tutti, tutte. Io sono Alessandro Marrone, responsabile del programma difesa dell'Istituto Affari Internazionali e moderatore di questo secondo panel di una 2 giorni molto intensa e variegata. Ringrazio intanto il panel precedente per gli interessanti spunti di riflessione sulla guerra e sull'ordine liberale internazionale e sugli scenari futuri. E ringrazio anche gli speaker qui al tavolo con me per affrontare un tema di attualità come il concetto strategico nato. And also as a courtesy to the speakers, I'm switched to English to make it more smooth for all of them. So as you know, NATO approved the strategic concept just 1 week ago at the Madrid summit. So it's a very new document. So I further thank the speakers for addressing such a novelty in their intervention. Since we are still a bit late, I will go straight to the questions for each of them. And I'm going to ask to keep each speech in 7 minutes in order to have possibly a round of questions from the audience, and in any case, to close on time and give you the opportunity to enjoy the real coffee break at the end of this panel. So I will start not in the alphabetic order, but in a more, let's say, from global to local, or at least to national perspective. And I will start with Thierry Tardy, Research Director at NATO Defense College, with a question about how the strategic concept actually mentioned both Russia and China as somehow as adversaries, and it reflects the dichotomy mentioned before between democracies and autocratic states, but Russia and China are profiled in a different way in the concept. So I would like to ask your opinion about the NATO posture vis-à-vis these two world powers. Thierry, the floor is yours.
Grazie mille Alessandro, e vorrei poter parlare in italiano perché abito a Roma da 4 anni, ma purtroppo non posso. Allora I'm going to speak in English.
But thank you for your effort.
To the relief of Alessandro, I was seeing his face and he was thinking the guy is going to speak Italian for 6 minutes. So thanks a lot for the invitation, Yai, Natalie and Alessandro, to such a beautiful place. So I'm by and large asked to do a kind of comparative analysis between what the strategic concept says about Russia and what it says about China, which I will do to an extent, but my main message is to tell you that the concept is Russia-centric. It is about Russia. It is shaped by what has happened at least since 24th of February. And it is not China-centric. It says a lot about China. There are new elements that we need to factor in and analyze and understand. But in terms of political posture and operational implications, the concept is about Russia and less about China. So I'm going to develop a bit this to back up my point. So first, NATO's posture vis-à-vis Russia, and of course I refer here to the strategic concept, specifically released last week. And I distinguish here, when it comes to NATO's posture vis-à-vis Russia, the political and the operational levels. At the political level, Russia becomes the driving factor of NATO's posture in the concept. As I said, the strategic concept is to a large degree Russia-centric. The rhetoric on NATO's side is defensive, and it is to a degree confrontational, with words to qualify Russia such as, I quote, direct threat, spheres of influence, coercion, subversion, aggression, proven willingness to use force, disruptive, coercive nuclear signaling, challenge to our security and interests. So the threat is clearly identified at the political level. And in response, the concept talks about collective defense, about deterrence and defense, which is a core task, It defines a new force model. It defines a new defense posture. That is pretty clear in the concept. Yet the concept also says that NATO does not seek confrontation, and I quote, "We remain willing to keep open channels of communication with Moscow to manage and mitigate risks." That's for the political posture. Operationally, that's probably the most important. The concept and the final communique and a series of documents that are adopted in parallel adopt a new force model. So I don't want to be too technical here, but the new force model or the new forward defense posture is about a shift from deterrence by tripwire to deterrence by defense. So I need to explain that a bit. Deterrence by tripwire is the posture that NATO adopted post the Ukraine crisis in 2014. So light forces, battle group formations deployed in the 4 countries, 3 Baltic states, and Poland. Not big formations. The idea was to send a political signal. This is what is meant by tripwire. Now NATO moves away from that posture and embraces a forward defense posture, which is about deterrence by defense, by denial, meaning that NATO is going to deploy more assets on the eastern flank to be able to deter Russia beyond the symbolic posture of the post-2014 situation. So 5 quickly issues that signify the reinforcement. More troops, that's the quantitative approach. So 8 countries are now concerned with the deployment of troops, not only 3 Baltic states, Poland, but also Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary. Second, more enablers, that's the qualitative evolution, so more intelligence, more communication, more interoperability, more air defense, more air assets that will enable the troops that are being deployed to be more effective. Third, pre-deployed assets and ammunitions in the 8 countries that I mentioned, which was not the case before. Fourth, pre-assigned troops. That's an interesting concept by which from now on, if the decisions are implemented, which is another issue, from now on you will have in Western European states that are NATO allies pre-assigned troops to particular countries. So Germany is going to partner with Lithuania, the UK with Estonia, France with Romania, so that they can train together, do exercises together, do the pre-deployment troops and assets so that they can be used if need be in this kind of bilateral partnership. And fifth, the higher level of readiness. That's all over the media, you've probably seen it. I think it's quite controversial, but the idea is now to move away from the NATO response force, which is 40,000 strong force to be deployed in 15 days, already a challenge for NATO, but to move for that format, 40,000 of the NATO response force, to, according to the SecGen, a force composed of 300,000 troops to be deployed in 30 days. Happy to take questions about how feasible this is, and so you will probably have your own opinion, but that's the intention. So a big difference in terms of the posture that is signified by those 5 levels of evolution. And the big questions here, before I turn to China, first is, will allies stay united in the implementation of those decisions and in the Russia-centric approach that is being adopted? And second, will allies deliver? What I've just alluded to, moving from 40,000 to 300,000 troops on high readiness by 2023, which is next year, or 2024, is a big challenge, and it's only the beginning of the discussion. The NATO posture vis-à-vis China is very different. I'm tempted to say it's more symbolic. I don't want to say that because there are words and wording in the concept that we need to analyze. It's the first time that a strategic concept talks about China. The previous one did not. Although the wording of the concept is not very different from the wording of the final communique of the June 2021 NATO summit. There are similarities. The rhetoric on China is also defensive and to an extent confrontational. So it says that the People's Republic of China's stated ambitions and coercive policies challenge or interests, security, and values. If I had to give a definition of what a threat is, I would say a threat is something that challenges my interest, my security, and my values, right? Well, the word threat is not being used, but that's how China is being characterized. China is characterized as being opaque. The concept talks about China's malicious hybrid and cyber operations. It talks about the strategic partnership between Russia and China, which counters our values and interests. It talks about the systemic challenges posed by China to euro-atlantic security, and that term was already in the 2021 final communique. It also says that we will stand up to our shared values and the rules-based international order, including freedom of navigation, which is a clear indication that China might challenge that freedom of navigation, that NATO wants to respond to that. And finally, China is also mentioned under the NATO-EU cooperation, which is a new insertion, saying, I quote, "We will enhance the NATO-EU strategic partnership in addressing the systemic challenges posed by the PRC to Euro-Atlantic security." So the challenge is identified, the domains are identified, but most of them are not military, which of course is an issue for NATO. And in practice, this is unlikely to lead to major evolutions in NATO's posture. First, because there is a political issue, the absence of a wide consensus across allies on how to respond to China, which was reflected in the discussions leading to the concept, and also because it's not obvious to identify how NATO is going to respond to issues that, again, for many of them are not military in nature. So just a few things or domains where NATO can play a role. First, political level, the idea of a political dialogue is being discussed. Some are mentioning the idea of a NATO-China Council, but there are resistance given the results achieved by the NATO-Russia Council. In terms of defense posture, I doubt that a lot will happen, if only because the priority is Russia and the eastern flank, as simple as this. And then beyond this, there are at least 3 or 4 domains where NATO can play a role. Cyber, space, that are mentioned in the concept. Then second or third partnerships with like-minded states. You may have noticed that the 4, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and Korea, were invited at the summit, and the idea is very much to partner with like-minded states that have issues with China. And fourth, maritime security, leading back to the issue of addressing the freedom of navigation, possibly beyond the Euro-Atlantic area. So there are domains where NATO can play a role with China in the background. And let me end, because I know we have time constraint, Alessandro, with 2 issues where Russia and China converge in a way which is interesting in itself in the context of the new concept. One is the fact that the strategic concept says, I quote, "The deepening strategic partnership between the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation and their mutually reinforcing attempts to undercut the rules-based international order run counter to our values and interests." The concept makes the link between the 2 challenges or threats, challenges. And the concept also says that there are developments in the Indo-Pacific that can directly affect Euro-Atlantic security. So there is a political linkage between Russia and China and a geographical or strategic linkage between 2 geographical areas, the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific, and the Euro-Atlantic security. And the second element by which the 2 countries converge is the US pivot to Asia. And the fact that beyond what is happening today and beyond the priority for the US and for NATO on Russia, there is the pivot that is looming, and that raises a question for NATO about how NATO is going to be in charge of the eastern flank and the European geographical area to free up resources for the US to deal with the Asia-Pacific, especially if the situation deteriorates there, which is something that we cannot exclude at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thierry. Thank you very much for a very good analysis of NATO political and military posture, which, by the way, matches very well with the Alcaro-Coralluzzo scenario on a Cold War in Europe, and therefore a Russia-centric NATO to hold the line. And lots of things to say, but I'll leave for the Q&A. And I move swiftly to Tara Varma, Director of Office of Paris of the European Council of Foreign Relations. Tara, my question for you does not regard NATO adversaries, but NATO partners, and particularly the European Union, because at least in my view, the strategic concept makes an opening toward European defense and the EU defense initiative in a good spirit, in a good faith, although with several caveats, because in NATO we have also Turkey, UK, which are not at ease with the EU for different reasons. So I wanted to ask you your opinion exactly on that, on NATO approach to European Union in light of the strategic concept.
Thanks a lot, Alessandro. Thanks to Yai as well for the invitation. I too am in awe of this wonderful building where we are hosted, so thank you to the city of Turin. You are right. I think the mention of the EU as a unique and essential partner in the strategic concept, to me, is really a novelty. And I would say it's all the more interesting that we participated at ECFR with other think tanks in the drafting process with the drafters of the NATO strategic concept. And several of us raised the issue that actually the uniqueness of the partnership with the EU should be raised at some point. In the previous strategic concept, the EU was one amongst the 39 other strategic partners that NATO had, and I think that probably is a bit complicated until very recently. 21 out of the 30 NATO members were members of the EU as well, and they will soon be actually 23 EU members who are also part of NATO. That raises a number of issues, actually. A number of observers are saying, well, isn't this the opportunity to basically kill European defense? If 95% of the European continent is protected by NATO, should we maybe stop talking about European defense and decide that this is dealt with by NATO? My sense is that we can actually reverse this logic. It is precisely because 23 out of 30 NATO members are going to be EU members as well that we need to invest even more in European defense. And in that sense, the war in Ukraine, of course, has been a game changer. If you look at the reaction on the 24th of February already, Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, Ursula von der Leyen, the President Commission, and Charles Michel, the President of the EU Council, met, and they decided together that there needed to be a reinforced EU-NATO cooperation. Looking today at what they did, I wouldn't say it's perfect, but there has been a certain division of labor that has worked until now. And of course, one of the issues that the first panel addressed is the extent to which what has worked until now, whether it's going to work later on. But how has this worked? NATO reinforced its posture in the East. I think its deterrence was reaffirmed. It kept saying that it wasn't confrontational, that it didn't want to escalate, but that it was going to defend what it was supposed to defend. The EU, on the other hand, of course, imposed sanctions. The first 5 packages were imposed relatively swiftly with a lot of unity, but it also provided financial, material, and military aid to Ukraine, and in an unprecedented manner, it also delivered lethal weapons to Ukraine. This had never happened before. It is quite a feat for a political project whose sole purpose initially was to promote peace. It was really a Copernican revolution in the EU. The European Peace Facility was activated, and through it, until now, 2 billion euros were given to Ukraine. 2 years ago, when the MFF was discussed and new financial planning was planned for the EU for the next 7 years, so basically the 2020-2027 period, it was decided that from an ambition 15 billion euro for the European Defence Fund, there would actually be only 7 billion invested. So basically, what the EU has given to Ukraine in the past 4 months is almost a third of what we have planned for ourselves to invest in the new horizon. Again, I'm not saying this is perfect. I'm also not saying this is enough. There are big questions now for the EU as to how we institutionalize not only our aid to Ukraine, but our willingness to invest more in defense. And we will need to do this in a much more coordinated manner with NATO, because this is also something that is lacking today. We don't have an appropriate and dedicated platform to discuss EU-NATO security cooperation as of today. Maybe this wasn't needed until now. I would say now we definitely need it. Because as you said, Alessandro, there are members of NATO who are quite fearful of NATO becoming basically a unique place for EU-US security cooperation to be discussed. This is not the purpose of NATO. The purpose of NATO is another one. However, we do need today to have a platform where we discuss EU-NATO cooperation. So we need to create this. I think what has been declared in the concept is a first step, and it's an acknowledgement that is absolutely essential. To my sense, it does also convey the idea that there needs to be actually reinforced cooperation. In the 90s, the debate was very much about duplication, the fear of duplication and competition of industrial interests, both between the US and Europe, but also within European member states themselves. I think what we've seen now, and the war in Ukraine is an example of that, there has been duplication, but nobody complained about it. It was fine for different European member states to deliver weapons to Ukraine. It was also fine for the US to deliver them. I think we are precisely at a moment where we need to think about this strategically. We're doing it little by little. But what we will need to invest in, and what is going to be a very complicated discussion, is of course how we create and consolidate the European defense industrial base. This will need to be an EU-NATO discussion as well. And I think duplication is, the fear of duplication is probably a fear of the past. But we will need to ensure that if we are serious about European defense, and we are serious about the continent rearming itself, because as the concept says, the euro-atlantic area is not at peace anymore, then we will need to take serious measures to answer this. I am not, as of yet, seeing a dynamic in favor of these decisions, but I am quite hopeful that they will take place.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you very much, because you gave a European perspective which is pretty much resonate also much of the feelings of the audience. At TI, in Turin, and in Italy, being Italy, the staunchest supporter of a win-win perspective for NATO and the EU, and strategic autonomy going together with transatlantic cohesion.
I didn't mention it, as you see, the word strategic autonomy, but I'm happy that you did. We can discuss it.
Oh, come on. It's the elephant in the room, so I take the liberty to mention it. Let's not forget where we were a few years ago and the progress is made in this regard. Passo all'italiano per i nostri prossimi due speaker. In particolare vorrei affrontare un dominio molto specifico, che è quello dello spazio. Thierry giustamente ha sottolineato come il concetto strategico dedichi molta importanza allo spazio, cosa che il documento del 2010 non faceva. L'Unione Europea sta lavorando molto sullo spazio già da tempo, ma sempre più in chiave di sicurezza. È in cantiere una EU Space Strategy for Security and Defense. Se pensate 3 anni fa l'Unione Europea Space Strategy for Security and Defense era quasi impensabile. Noi come IAI eravamo avanti perché già l'anno scorso abbiamo preparato uno studio sul nesso tra spazio e difesa che è stato pubblicato a febbraio. Carolina Muti è una delle autrici e quindi le stelle sono allineate per chiedere a Carolina il suo pensiero su appunto la postura NATO rispetto allo spazio e in generale gli sviluppi nel dominio spaziale a questo punto di vista anche di sicurezza.
Sandro, io un pochino in linea con gli altri speaker ho preparato l'intervento in inglese, quindi I switched to English. I will concentrate on the space aspects mentioned in the strategic compass. In particular, I would like to recall some elements of novelty that are present in the space, in the strategic concept on the space part, and also maybe say what I would expect to see and what I haven't seen in this concept. So I think we could clearly see that the importance of space and technology in general is crystal clear in the concept. Sorry, when you read it. Space is mentioned 10 times in this document. Technology in different forms, technology innovation, technology, emerging technologies, 12 times. Just to give you a comparison, in the Lisbon document in 2010, space was mentioned just once and technology was mentioned twice. In particular, it already in that time had an element, an embryonical form of consideration for the technological trends that may disrupt the access of allies to space. So it mentioned the developments in the electronic warfare, and it was very shortly addressed, but there was this element. The second thing that I would like to say is that there is a considerable shift in how space is addressed in terms of language, terminology. So in part, it builds on previous decisions and policies by the Alliance in an incremental way, I would say, but it introduces also some important elements of novelty, as I already said. So, first of all, it makes clear and even more boldly that NATO considers space an operational domain per se. This means that this is a fifth domain together with the land, maritime, air, and cyber domains. But space is also an enabler for allied operations in other domains. So it is essential and necessary for operating in missions. Space is also essential for guaranteeing deterrence and defense. And in fact, this is, it is mentioned in the first bullet, if you read the document, the core tasks, and in the very first bullet point on defense and deterrence, space is there. In particular, it is considered, together with the cyber domain, as complementary to nuclear, conventional, and missile defense capabilities of the Alliance in its defense and deterrence posture. So, what is new? Because these are elements that already, let's say, we have seen in the last years. We have seen the Alliance presenting a space policy earlier this year in January, and also in 2019, presenting the space as operational domain, as already said. But what I believe is new is that space is recognized as a domain where authoritarian states conduct malicious activities. And this connection between authoritarian states and malicious activities linked to space, it's something that in a way brings us to a level up. The concept specifically and overtly mentions China striving to subvert rules-based order, including in space. So this is specified. And mentions strategic competitors that are recalled to invest in technologies that could restrict NATO access to space, degrade space capabilities, target civilian and military infrastructures. So I emphasize the word strategic competitors because this is a shift as well. For the first time, we have a clear recognition of the strategic competition in space, so evident in the document. If you take, for example, the space policy that was presented earlier this year, it quite precisely lists the threats and capabilities, the threats that the alliance should fear from space and within space, but also the capabilities that it should enhance. But the wording on the adversaries it refers to potential adversaries. So between potential adversaries and strategic competitors, we as well see a shift in a way. At the same time, the document states that single or cumulative set of malicious cyber activities or hostile operations to, from, or within space could lead for the alliance to invoke Article 5. At the same time, it also invites the allies to boost resilience of space and cyber capabilities and enhance its space capabilities in general. So the last element that it seems very interesting to me is that it mentions threats in space, like signal jamming or cyber attacks, that can come from non-state actors, including terrorist organizations. So overall, it seems that the space is consistently considered in the strategic concept, and this is done in a twofold way, both from a strategic competition perspective between big powers, but also potentially for an asymmetric hybrid conflict. So I will end with some challenges that I see. So, like every strategy, every concept, the reality check is implementation. So, in case of space, there is a clear ambition that is growing on space, on what NATO wants to be able to guarantee in space. But at the same time, NATO is not an independent actor in space. It doesn't have its own space capabilities, and just few allies have real capabilities in space. So one challenge would be how to implement pooling and sharing, considering the growing threats, the congested, competitive environment that the allies are facing in space. And two things that I wanted to, I would expect to see in the concept, but I haven't, is the first one, partnership between the EU and NATO in space. There are various sectors mentioned under security cooperation and partnership between EU and NATO. There is military mobility, there is resilience, there is emerging technologies. Space is not there. And considering what Alessandro has said before, that exactly in this moment the EU is drafting its own EU strategy for security and defense, it would be good that these two documents talk to each other in a way. And the second thing is a clearer recognition of the importance of civilian and commercial actors and the importance of a civil-military partnership for space, specifically for this sector, because from what we hear from practitioners, even the bigger space powers like the United States are having issues, are challenged in controlling the rapidity in which technology development goes in the civilian and commercial sectors. So there are some developments that I would have liked to see in the document. So I will stop here.
Thank you, Carolina. Grazie Carolina, innanzitutto chiedo scusa se sull'onda dell'entusiasmo per lo spazio non ti ho introdotto adeguatamente con l'affiliation. Carolina Muti è ricercatrice nei programmi sicurezza e difesa dell'Istituto Affari Internazionali. Grazie Carolina per questo zoom sullo spazio dalla prospettiva NATO, che ha sottolineato appunto la nuova rilevanza dello spazio per la NATO, la nuova comprensione da parte alleata dello spazio. Chissà, forse anche l'interazione dell'OIA con il drafting riguardo a questo tema ha aiutato. Poi chiederemo agli estensori lo strategic concept perché l'Unione Europea non è nominata quando si tratta di cooperazione nello spazio, o meglio viceversa, perché lo spazio non è nominato nella cooperazione con l'UE. Ultimo ma non ultimo speaker in questo panel. Anche in questo panel abbiamo tenuto fede all'impegno di combinare un'expertise globale e locale, e quindi sono molto lieto e onorato di avere al tavolo il generale Mauro Dubaldi, che è il comandante per la formazione e la scuola di applicazione dell'esercito, che è basata qui a Torino, nello splendido Palazzo Arsenale a pochi minuti a piedi da qui, che vi invito a visitare alla vostra prima occasione. Non è solo una presenza fisica simbolica del generale Dubaldi, è una presenza di contenuto, perché la domanda è sulle implicazioni per le forze armate italiane del nuovo concetto strategico NATO. Perché vogliamo parlare di NATO, ma anche di Italia, e quindi l'Italia è un importante attore in ambito NATO, UE, ONU, di missioni all'estero, anche di difesa e deterrenza collettiva. Quindi la domanda è le implicazioni della nuova postura NATO quanto a formazione, addestramento, sviluppo capacitivo delle forze armate italiane. Prego, generale.
Grazie Alessandro, grazie a tutti. Approfitto per dire che in quel palazzo al quale hai fatto riferimento passeggiava un centinaio d'anni fa Camillo Benso di Cavour, il quale probabilmente non aveva visitato l'Italia sotto Firenze, ma si trova perfettamente a suo agio in città come Roma, come Parigi, quindi una certa idea d'Europa, come dice una iscrizione che io tengo molto vicino al cuore. Nella mia scuola l'Europa unita potrebbe cominciare da noi, messa nel 1985. Questa idea d'Europa ha molto a che fare con la mia scuola e sono molto d'accordo con quello che Tara ha appena detto. Vorrei che prendeste il mio breve intervento nella luce di una riflessione. È probabilmente la prima volta dalla Costituzione della NATO nella quale il rapporto nostro, diciamo così, dell'Occidente con le cosiddette democrazie imperfette o autocrazie vede queste ultime, coloro che la pensano diversamente da noi, non solo più numerosi, ma probabilmente in prospettiva con più risorse di quelle che abbiamo. Allora, da questo punto di vista, ciò che esce dal nuovo concetto strategico, che per dirla tutta non è rivoluzionario, perché chiaramente recepisce tutta una serie di riflessioni che molti degli stati membri hanno già fatto ed hanno già iniziato a mettere in campo, mette in prima luce, secondo me, un paio di argomenti. Una urgenza di pervenire a determinati obiettivi, ad esempio quelli di prontezza, come abbiamo visto, quindi obiettivi quantificabili, misurabili in qualche modo, ma alla stessa maniera una sensazione di diffusa instabilità. Allora, partendo dalla formazione, che è un po' il campo nel quale attualmente trovo la mia primaria responsabilità, io cerco di fare in modo che tutto sommato fin dall'inizio la formazione dei futuri comandanti per quanto riguarda le nostre forze armate abbia un qualcosa a che vedere con queste soglie molto più labili del passato, tra pace e guerra, ma anche tra competizione e conflitto, tra vero e verosimile, se non addirittura falso, per cui il fatto che si sia più abituati in qualche modo all'imprevedibilità. Il come farlo chiaramente è difficile. Oggi ho dei giovani colleghi, e faccio un esempio, che hanno recentemente partecipato a una competizione internazionale che è stata la Cyber Defense, tralasciando il fatto che la rappresentativa che ha vinto era del Politecnico di Torino e che uno dei rappresentanti della squadra aveva 16 anni, e questo ci dice già qualcosa relativamente al target. Io non voglio che i nostri ufficiali diventino degli hacker, logicamente, ma devono avere, e questo vale per tutta la classe dirigente della Forza Armata, una sensibilità rispetto a questi aspetti così immersivi, perché spazio e cyber fondamentalmente sono due facce che avranno un influsso totale all'interno della nostra realtà nel futuro. Quindi anche per i giovani, affinché abbiano una sensibilità particolare, perché perché si troveranno ad avere a che fare con dei decision makers che non sempre avranno la stessa sensibilità e conoscenza rispetto alle loro capacità di born digitals in qualche modo. Se passiamo rapidamente al discorso dell'addestramento, è logico che l'addestramento, mi viene sempre in mente Star Trek, il ponte olografico, cioè fare in modo di approfittare di tutte le opportunità della tecnologia in maniera tale che l'addestramento possa essere sempre più fantasioso e poter contenere tutte le possibili opportunità, ma allo stesso tempo è necessario, ed è un problema che l'Italia ha fortemente, di perseguire un addestramento reale e credibile anche di un determinato livello di unità. È una cosa che in Italia diventa veramente molto difficile per la carenza di poligoni e anche dal punto di vista, secondo me, del contatto internazionale. Questa cosa deve essere ricercata. Faccio una parentesi sul contatto internazionale tornando alla formazione. A Torino siamo molto attenti al programma europeo dell'Exchange of Military Young Officers. All'interno della scuola abbiamo giovani colleghi che vengono da moltissimi istituti di formazione europei e l'anno prossimo inaugureremo un semestre internazionale. Insomma, l'Erasmus militare ha un significato, perché se l'esercito europeo è un pensiero, è un obiettivo forse di medio termine, educare i giovani alla luce di ideali e di valori che sono basici per l'Unione, probabilmente insomma dal basso si riesce veramente a fare qualcosa. Il comando e controllo, mi diceva Alessandro, è chiaro che l'impatto che i big data e l'intelligenza artificiale avranno sul comando e controllo è una cosa assolutamente dirimente. Dobbiamo studiare molto ed essere pronti a capire cosa può essere fatto in termini di drammatico incremento della efficienza che le procedure automatizzate, ancora l'intelligenza artificiale, potranno darci, ma chiaramente la sfida è quella di rimanere doverosamente in controllo di quella che è la situazione, perché è chiaro, e in questi giorni leggiamo anche un po' di racconti fantasiosi sui progressi senzienti delle macchine. Insomma, noi abbiamo la necessità, soprattutto nel campo militare, di avere il controllo di tutto quello che succede affinché l'automazione sia un sostegno e non diventi in qualche modo, Dio non voglia, un driving factor al quale cercare di andare dietro. Me la caverò, essendo l'ultima cosa che rimane tra tutti noi e il coffee break, mettendo un po' insieme tutto il resto e facendo un ragionamento un po' europeista. Io voglio citare anch'io Jean-Claude Juncker quando, credo nel 2018, diceva che in Europa abbiamo qualcosa come 178 diversi sistemi d'arma, 17 tipi di carri da combattimento, probabilmente più elicotteri che governi disposti a comprarli. Allora, tornando al discorso delle risorse a disposizione di questo big ally nell'ambito della Nato e di quello che tutti insieme come partner Nato possiamo fare in un mondo che vede i nostri competitors in prospettiva molto forti e con molte meno vergogne di quelle che abbiamo noi nell'affrontare i problemi e prendere il toro per le corna, visto che siamo a Torino, possiamo dirlo riprendendo il simbolo della città. E da questo punto di vista io credo che sia fondamentale pervenire a una identificazione delle capacità e di avere il coraggio in ambito europeo, perché poi possa eventualmente contaminarsi al più largo ambito dell'intera alleanza, come posso dire, traguardare la competizione in una maniera molto più lungimirante. In questi anni noi abbiamo avuto una volontà protezionistica nei confronti delle nostre industrie, ci siamo spaccati e spezzati, dividendo in pacchetti alle volte irrilevanti le nostre capacità di ricerca, le nostre capacità di procurement, va da sé chiaramente tutta l'impronta logistica. E io credo che non possiamo più permetterci di farlo, perché solamente essendo insieme, e a mio modo di vedere l'Europa potrebbe essere il pivot attraverso la quale la Nato potrebbe effettivamente scaricare a terra l'enorme cilindrata che continua ad avere, tramite però la capacità di traguardare obiettivi e capacità comuni in maniera tale da ottimizzare le capacità che noi abbiamo, in modo da prendere in considerazione in maniera molto importante quello che Juncker diceva e fare in modo che si proceda insieme anche guardando, e questa è la cosa con cui chiudo, a quella che sarà l'identità futura dell'industria per la difesa europea, che a mio modo di vedere non ha un futuro come player credibile a livello di mercato internazionale se non mettendosi in qualche modo insieme, perseguendo degli obiettivi comuni che siano di consolidamento delle capacità dell'Unione, separated but not separable, come si diceva una volta, all'interno dell'Alleanza Atlantica. Grazie.
Rimanete seduti perché gli speaker sono stati così bravi da chiudere 5 minuti prima, nonostante essere partiti 10 minuti dopo, quindi c'è tempo per domande dal pubblico. So che c'è un pubblico qualificato, di colleghi, di studenti, di ufficiali, di rappresentanti di Torino e altrove. Se qualcuno vuole fare una domanda può alzare la mano e cogliere un'occasione.
Ecco, volevo solo parlare io al signor ufficiale. Si è parlato molto in questi mesi dell'avanzata dell'esercito russo, però l'avanzata alla fine si è bloccata. Non è emblematico la differenza con l'Iraq del 2003. Gli americani nel giro di neanche un mese, partendo da un altro continente, erano arrivati a Baghdad. I russi, partendo dalla frontiera senza ostacoli, sono bloccati nel Donbass, nonostante che non devono trasportare gli eserciti da un altro continente e abbiano tutte le infrastrutture vicino. Non è anche un sintomo di una differenza fra un esercito volontario e un esercito professionista? L'esercito americano è volontario, quello russo per esempio è obbligatorio ed è minato da piaghe come il nonnismo o come il bullismo.
Ma allora io non entrerò chiaramente nel dettaglio. Intanto c'è una citazione che mi è piaciuta ultimamente, che è quella di riferirsi al conflitto russo-ucraino come di fatto il primo conflitto simmetrico dell'era digitale, nel senso che tutto sommato Russia e Ucraina, e questo come abbiamo sentito è piacevolmente sorprendente, diciamo, se dobbiamo stare da una certa parte, esprimono le stesse capacità. È naturale che vediamo, questo posso riportarlo alla parte della formazione, che alcuni legami di tenuta, come quelli del legame alla propria terra, come quelli di combattere per i fondamenti più originari del proprio essere, del proprio sentirsi cittadini, risorsa ultima di uno Stato, continua ad essere anche nell'era digitale, anche nelle armi automatiche, anche nella grande tecnologia, qualcosa che è in grado di far diventare molto più ampie le capacità di unità militari in questo caso, e che quindi anche nel mondo che spersonalizza apparentemente le componenti umane dei sistemi di difesa, il fatto di avere delle motivazioni enormemente superiori a quelle che l'opponente ha è ancora un parametro che può fare la differenza.
Allora, grazie al comandante Dubaldi intanto per una panoramica a 360 gradi, ma molto sintetica e efficace, sulla visione delle forze armate italiane quanto appunto formazione, sviluppo tecnologico e futuro dei conflitti. Grazie per non essersi tirato indietro di fronte al fuoco inatteso delle domande. E grazie a tutti e quattro le speaker e gli speaker di questo panel, spero sia stato interessante. Grazie a voi per l'attenzione.